Chapter 13 of Murder at Bridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Murder at Bridge by Anne Austen. Chapter 13. "I'll read you the note, Lydia, but I can't let you touch it," Dundee said sternly, taking good care that she should not touch either the paper on which the note to herself had been written, or the sheet which contained that strange, informal will. Informal in spite of the dead woman's obvious effort to couch it in legal phraseology. Was Lydia's frenzy assumed? Did she hope to leave fingerprints now which would account for fingerprints she had already left upon it? Was it not possible that Lydia's had been the prying fingers which had opened the envelope after Nita Selim had sealed it with God only knew what fears in her heart? If so, Lydia Carr had found that she was her mistress's sole legatee. Revenge, coupled with greed. What better motive for murder could a detective ask? And who had had so good an opportunity as Lydia Carr to dispose of the weapon? The woman crouched back on her haunches, an agony of pleading in her single eye. "Lydia, I think you know already what this note tells you," Dundee said slowly. To his astonishment the maid nodded, the tears starting again. "I asked her once what she wanted to keep that old dress for, and she said I'd find out some day, but I never dreamed she'd want it for a oh, my God, for a shroud!" For the second time that evening Lydia Carr completely routed Dundee's carefully worked up case against her. It was inconceivable, he told himself, that a mind cunning enough to have executed this murder would give itself away in such a fashion. If she had indeed pried among her mistress's papers and found the will and note, would she not, from the most primitive instinct of self-preservation, have pretended total ignorance of the note's contents? "I'll read the note, Lydia," he said gently. "It is addressed, 'My precious old Lydia.'" "She was always calling me that," the maid sobbed. "And she writes: 'If you ever read this it will be because I am dead. And you'll know that I've tried to make it up to you the only way I knew. I never could believe you really forgave me, but maybe you will now. And there is one last thing I want you to do for me, Lydia darling. You remember that old royal blue velvet dress of mine that you were always sniffing at and either trying to make me give away or have made over? And remember that I told you that you'd know sometime why I'd kept it? Well, I want you to lay me out in it, Lydia. Such a funny old-fashioned shroud, isn't it? But with dresses long again, maybe it won't look so funny, and there'll be nobody but you and Lois to see me in it, because I've said so in my will. And I want my hair dressed as it was the only time I ever wore the royal blue velvet. A French roll, Lydia, with curls coming out the left side of it, and hanging down to the left ear. You brush the hair straight up the back of the head, gather it together, and tie a little bit of black shoestring around it. Then you twist the hair into a roll and spread it high, pinning it down on each side of the head. And don't forget the little curls on the left side. I hope I have enough hair, but if it hasn't grown long enough, you know where those switches are that I had made when I first bobbed my hair. You won't mind touching me when I'm dead, will you, Lydia? I do love you, Nita." Dundee was silent for a minute after he had finished reading the strange note and had returned it to the envelope, along with the will. At last, speaking against a lump in his throat, he broke in on the desolate sobbing of Nita's maid. "Lydia, how old was your mistress?" "You won't put it in the papers, will you?" Lydia pleaded. She was 33, but not a soul knew it except me." "And will you tell me how old the royal blue velvet dress is?" he continued. "Also how long since girls dress their hair in a French roll?" "The dress is 12 or 13 years old," Lydia said, her voice dull now with grief. "I know, because I used to do dressmaking during the war. And it was during the war that the girls wore their hair that way. I did mine in a psych knot, but the French roll was more stylish." "Did your mistress ever tell you about the one time she wore the dress?" Lydia shook her head. "No, she wouldn't talk about it. Just said I'd know sometime why she kept it. Royal blue velvet, it is, the skirt halfway to the ankle, and sleeves with long, pointed ends, lined with gold taffeta, and finished off with gold tassels. It's in a dress bag hanging in her closet."
"Do you think it was her wedding dress, Lydia?" Dundee suggested, the idea suddenly flashing into his mind.
"I don't know. I didn't ask her that."
Lydia denied dully.
"Can I take it with me, and the switches she had made of her curls?"
"I'll have to get authority to remove anything from the house, Lydia," Dundee told her. "But I am sure you will be permitted to follow Mrs. Selim's instructions. So you're going to accept the Miles' offer of a job as nurse?"
"Yes, I'd rather work. Mr. and Mrs. Miles have always been specially nice to me, and I could love their children. They're not afraid of me."
"Perhaps you're wise," Dundee agreed. "By the way, Lydia, did Mrs. Selim have a pistol in her possession at any time during the past week?"
The maid shook her head. "Not that I seen. And if she got one because she was afraid, she'd 'a' kept it handy, and I'd 'a' been bound to see it." Convinced of her sincerity, he was about to let her go pack her bag when another belated question occurred to him.
"Lydia, will you tell me what engagements Mrs. Selim had this last week?"
The woman scowled, fanatically jealous, Dundee guessed, of her mistress's reputation, but at last she answered defiantly: "Lemme see. Mr. Sprague had Sunday dinner here, and spent the afternoon. But Sunday night it was young Mr. Ralph Hammond. He came whenever she'd let him. Monday night, oh, yes, she had dinner at the country club with the Mileses and the Drakes and the Dunlaps. Mr. Miles brought her home because Mr. Sprague wasn't invited. Tuesday night, lemme think. Yes, that's the night Judge Marshall was here. Nita had sent for him to talk about finishing up the attic."
So that was the "business engagement" which Judge Marshall had hemmed and hawed over, Dundee reflected triumphantly.
"And Wednesday night," Lydia was continuing, with a certain pride in her mistress's popularity, "she was at a dinner party at the Dunlaps."
"Did Mr. Peter Dunlap ever call on Mrs. Selim alone?"
"Him?" Lydia was curiously resentful. "He wasn't ever here. Nita said to me she wished Mr. Peter liked her as well as Miss Lois did."
"Thursday night?"
"Mr. Ralph Hammond took her somewhere to dinner, to some other town, I think. But I wasn't awake when they got home. Nita would never let me sit up for her. Said I needed my rest. So I always went to bed early."
"And yesterday, Friday?" demanded Dundee tensely, for Friday she had been driven to making her last will and testament.
"She was home all day. About 4:30 Mr. Drake came," Lydia said slowly, as if she too were wondering. "She was awfully restless. Couldn't sit still or eat. I ought to have suspicioned something, but she was often like that lately. Mr. Drake stayed about an hour, but I didn't see him leave, because I was cooking Nita's dinner. But little good it did, because she didn't eat it, so there was plenty for Mr. Sprague when he dropped in about 7.
"Did Mr. Sprague spend the evening?"
"I guess so, but I don't know. Nita made me take the Ford and drive into town for a picture show. She was in bed when I got back, and " But she checked herself hastily.
"Did Nita seem strange, troubled, excited? Did she look as if she had been crying?" Dundee prodded.
"I didn't see her," the maid acknowledged. "I knocked on her door, but she told me to go on to bed, that she wouldn't need me. But now I think back, her voice sounded queer. Maybe she was crying, but I don't know."
"And this morning?"
"She seemed all right, just excited about the party, and worried about my tooth. Mr. Ralph Hammond come to make the estimates on finishing up the top floor, and we left him here."
"What was her attitude towards Mr. Miles when he dropped in on her this morning?" Dundee interrupted.
"Mr. Miles?" Lydia echoed, frowning. "He wasn't here this morning, or if he was, it was after Nita and I had left for town." While the maid was packing a bag which Dundee would examine before she was allowed to take it away with her, the detective rejoined Tracy Miles, who had made himself as comfortable as possible in the living room. "Lydia's going with you, and is grateful for your wife's kindness," Dundee informed him, and felt his heart warm to the boresome, egotistical little cherub of a man when he saw how Miles's face lit up with real pleasure. "By the way, Miles, you saw Ralph Hammond when you called here this morning, didn't you?" "Yes," Miles answered with some reluctance. "He answered the door when I rang and told me Lydia and Nita had gone to town." "Mr. Miles," Dundee began slowly, throwing friendliness and persuasion into his voice, "I know how all you folk stick together, but I'd appreciate it a lot if you'd tell me frankly whether you'd noticed anything unusual in Hammond's manner this morning." "Unusual?" Miles repeated, frowning. "He was a little short with me, because he was busy, and I suspect a little jealous because I'd come calling on Nita." He broke off abruptly in obvious distress. "Look here, Dundee, I didn't mean to say that, but I suppose you'll find out sooner or later. Well, the fact is, the whole crowd knows Ralph Hammond was absolutely mad about Nita Selim, wanted to marry her, and made no secret of it, though we all thought or hoped it would be little Penny Crain. He's been devoted to Penny for years, and since Roger Crain made a mess of things and skipped out, leaving Penny and her poor mother high and dry, we've all done our best to throw Penny and Ralph together. But since Nita came to town " "Was Nita in love with Ralph?" Dundee cut in rather curtly, for he had a curious distaste for hearing Penny Crain discussed in this manner. "Sometimes we were sure she was," Miles answered. "She flirted with all us men, had a way with her of making every man she talked to think he was the only pebble on the beach. But there was something special in the way she looked at Ralph. Yes, I think she was in love with him. But then again," he frowned, "she would treat him like a dog, seemed to want to drive him away from her, but she always called him back. Oh, Lord!" he interrupted himself with a groan. "Now I suppose I have put my foot in it. You've got the damnedest way of making a chap tell everything he would cut his tongue out rather than spill, Dundee. But just because a young man's in love, and happens not to show up at a party is no reason to think he sneaked up to the house and killed the woman he loved and wanted to marry. For I'm not so dumb that I haven't seen the drift of your damnable questions, Dundee. Do you know Ralph Hammond by any chance?" he concluded, his round face red with anger. "No, but I should like to meet him," Dundee retorted. "He seems quite hard to locate this evening." "Well, when you do meet him," Tracy Miles began violently, his blue eyes blazing with anger, "you'll soon find you've been barking up the wrong tree. There's not a cleaner, finer, straighter " "In fact, he is a friend of yours, Miles," Dundee answered soothingly, "and I respect you for every word you've said. By the way, did all of you go to the country club for dinner after you left here?" Somewhat mollified, Miles answered, "All of us but Clive Hammond. He said he was going to have a look around for Ralph himself. Seemed to have an idea where he might find him. And oh yes, Sprague disappeared in the scramble. He hasn't a car and nobody thought of offering him a lift. Guess he took a bus into Hamilton. Ah, here's Lydia. Hello, Lydia," he called heartily to the woman who was standing tall and gaunt in the doorway. "Mighty glad you're coming to look after the kids." From behind the black veil which draped her ugly black hat and hid her scarred face, Lydia answered in the dull, harsh voice that was characteristic of her. "Thank you, sir. I'll do my best." She made no protest when Dundee, with a word of embarrassed apology, went rapidly through the heavy suitcase she brought up from the basement with her, and when he had finished his fruitless search she knelt and silently smoothed the coarse, utilitarian garments he had disarranged. 5 minutes later Dundee was alone in the house where murder had been committed under such strange and baffling circumstances that afternoon. He was not nervous, but again he made a tour of inspection on the first floor and basement, looking into closets and testing windows to make sure they were all locked. Everywhere there were evidences of the thoroughness of the police detectives who had searched for the weapon with which Nita Selim had been murdered. In the basement, as he had subconsciously noted on his headlong dash to question Lydia Carr, the furnace doors swung open, and the lids of the laundry tubs had been left propped up, after the unavailing search. He plodded wearily up the basement stairs and on into the kitchen. Perhaps the icebox had something fit to eat in it, the fruit intended for Nita's and Lydia's Sunday breakfast. Those caviar and anchovy sandwiches had certainly not stuck with him long. He was making his way towards the electric refrigerator when he stopped as suddenly as if he had been shot.
The kitchen door, which he had taken especial pains to assure himself was locked when he had made the rounds immediately after the departure of Captain Strawn and his men, was standing slightly ajar. Someone had entered this house. Dundee stared blankly at the door, which was equipped with a Yale lock. Someone with a key? But why had the door been left ajar? To make escape more noiseless? With the toe of his shoe Dundee pushed the door to and heard the click of the lock. Then all thought of food routed from his mind, made a quick but almost silent dash into the dining room to secure one of the pair of tall wax tapers, which, in their silver candlesticks, served as ornaments for the sideboard. If the intruder was still in the house, he could be nowhere but in that unfinished half of the gabled top story. The nearer stairs were those in the back hall, and Dundee took them two at a time, regardless of the noise. Who had preceded him stealthily? By the aid of his lighted candle he discovered an electric switch at the head of the stairs, flicked it on, and found himself in a wide hall, one wall of which was finished with buff-tinted plaster and with 3 doors, the other of rough boards with but a single door. With his candle held high so that its light should not blind him, and well aware that it made him a perfect target, Dundee opened the unpainted door and found himself in the dark, musty-smelling room that had served Nita Selim and the Crains before her as a storeroom. From the ceiling dangled a green cord ending in a cheap, clear glass bulb, but its light was sufficient to penetrate even the furthest low nooks made by these 3 gables. He blew out his candle and dropped it, as useless now. A quick tour convinced him that nothing human was concealed behind one of Nita Selim's empty wardrobe trunks, or behind one of the several pieces of heavy old furniture undoubtedly left behind by the dispossessed Crane family. Big footprints on the thick dust which coated the floor showed them that he had been no more thorough than Captain Strawn's brace of plain-clothes detectives had been much earlier that evening. 2 pairs of giant footprints. With an exclamation he discovered a smaller, narrower pair of prints, and followed their winding trail all around and across the attic. And then he remembered Ralph Hammond's footprints, of course, made that morning as he went about his legitimate business of measuring and estimating for the job of turning the storeroom into bedrooms and bathrooms. Dundee had not realized that he was frightened until he was in the hall again, facing one of the 3 doors in the plastered wall. With surprise and some amusement he became aware that his hands were trembling, and that his knees had a curious tendency to buckle. The fact that the door directly in front of him was open about 2 inches served, for some odd reason, to steady his nerves. Pushing the door wide open with his foot, for he never forgot the possibility of incriminating fingerprints which might easily be obliterated, he discovered a light switch near the door frame. The instant illumination from a ceiling cluster revealed a large bedroom, and less clearly another and smaller room beyond it, facing as the house faced, towards the south. Knees and hands steady again, he investigated the finished portion of the gable story swiftly. A charming layout, he told himself. Had Penny Crain once enjoyed this delightful little sitting room, with its tiny balcony built out upon the sloping roof? And it gave him pleasure to think that this big, well-furnished, but not fussily feminine bedroom had once been hers, as well as the small but perfect bathroom whose high, narrow window overlooked the back garden. The closets, dresser drawers, and highboy drawers were completely empty, however, of any traces of her occupancy, or that of any other. With these rooms going to waste, why, he suddenly asked himself, had Nita Selim coaxed Judge Marshall to have the unfinished half of the gabled attic turned into bedrooms and baths? Why couldn't Lydia have slept up here, if Nita thought so much of her faithful and beloved maid? But even as he asked himself the question, Dundee realized that the answer to it had been struggling to attract his attention. These rooms had not been wasted. Someone had been occupying them as late as last night. Weaving swiftly through the 3 rooms, like a bloodhound on the scent, Dundee collected the few but sufficient proofs to back up his intuitive conviction. A copy of the Hamilton Evening Sun, dated Friday, May 23rd, left in an armchair in the sitting room.
all windows raised about 6 inches from the bottom, so that the night breeze stirred the hand-blocked linen drapes, and, clinging to these drapes, the faint but unmistakable odour of cigarette smoke. Finally, with a low cry of triumph, Bonnie Dundee flung back the coloured linen spread which covered the three-quarter bed, and discovered that the sheets and pillow-cases, though clean, had, beyond a shadow of a doubt, been slept upon. Bending so that his nose almost touched a pillow-case, he sniffed. Pomade! Who was the man who had slept in this bed last night? Chapter 13.
14 of Murder at Bridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Murder at Bridge by Anne Austen. Chapter 14. With the thrill of his discovery singing blithely along his nerves, Bonnie Dundee, special investigator for the district attorney, had at first hugged the intention of following the new trail alone. Hadn't Captain Strawn taunted him not too good-naturedly about his ability to get along without the younger man's help? But he was glad, both selfishly and unselfishly, when, half an hour later, he threw open the front door of dead Nita's house to the chief of the homicide squad, Carraway the fingerprint expert, and the two plainclothesmen who had searched the top floor for the missing weapon or the murderer himself soon after the murder had been committed. For if Strawn needed his help, Dundee needed the expert machinery which Strawn captained. And it was good to feel the grip of gratitude in the old chief's hand-clasp and to see the almost shy twinkle of apology in his hard old gray eyes. Dundee led the way up the front stairs to the upper floor, glad to hear the heavy tread of official feet behind him. "I guess you've got it all doped out who the Selim woman's gentleman friend was," Strawn commented genially, as he followed Dundee into the pleasant big bedroom. "I believe I have, but I need Carraway to prove my hunch," Dundee acknowledged. Eagerly, swiftly, he displayed his first tangible finds: the open windows, the drapes smelling of cigarette smoke, the evening paper of the day before, the faint odor and greasiness of barber's pomade upon the pillowcase of the bed which had clearly been slept in since the linen was changed. "Now, Collins, Harmon," Dundee whirled upon the two silent plainclothesmen, "I want to know what you saw in these rooms when you searched them early this evening that you don't see now. You looked into the closets and drawers, of course?" "Yes, sir," Collins answered, "and they was all empty, Dundee. Me and Harmon didn't waste time smellin' pillowcases, and I admit we didn't pay no attention to that there newspaper." "Empty," Dundee echoed. "Are you sure? You too, Harmon?" "What are you driving at, boy?" Captain Strawn asked indulgently. Briefly, with disappointment flattening his voice, Dundee told of his finding the kitchen door ajar after he had made sure it was locked on his first rounds of the house. "I worked it out this way," he continued, despite Strawn's grin. "Dexter Sprague was Nita's lover, as I had thought all along. He was in the habit of spending the night here whenever Nita would give him an evening of her company. He was here last night, according to the maid, Lydia Carr. Nita sent her into Hamilton to a picture show. Nita and Sprague quarreled last night, but I am positive he spent the night here anyway. Certainly there was no actual rupture, since Sprague worded his note to her as he did. I have another strong reason for thinking his belongings were here at least until noon today, but that can wait for a moment. Furthermore, I am positive that Sprague descended by the back stairs and went around the house to join the cocktail party, which was to follow the hen bridge party." "How do you make that out, Bonnie?" Strawn asked, his grin wiped away. "Try to remember how Sprague looked when you first got here," Dundee suggested. "I saw him 20 minutes after you did, but he was wearing an immaculate stiff collar, and there were still traces of talcum powder over a close shave. And you will remember that he said he had made a half-hour's trip by bus, and had walked the quarter of a mile from the bus stop on Sheridan Road to this house. It was a mighty hot afternoon, Chief." "Not conclusive," Strawn growled. "Then here's another straw to add to the weight of my conclusion," Dundee went on, unshaken. "You remember that Janet Raymond was on the front porch, watching for Sprague, while the death hand of bridge was being played? Oh, she tried to protect him. Wait, I'll read you the notes I made when I was questioning her. I looked them up while I was waiting for you. Here. I said to Miss Raymond, 'You observed Mr. Sprague toiling down the rutty road, hot and weary, but romantic in the sunset? And she answered, stammering, I wasn't looking that way. And I knew she was lying, knew that she had been taken completely by surprise when Sprague suddenly appeared from the rear of the house. What's more, she betrayed herself and him by admitting that she was surprised. Then, because the girl is undoubtedly in love with Sprague and was mortally afraid he had killed Nita Selim, she tried frantically to throw suspicion on Lydia Carr by telling how Lydia had failed to answer Mrs. Dunlap's first ring. Good Lord! Wait a minute! I want to think! He interrupted himself to exclaim. After a full minute, while he stood very still, with his fingers pressed against his closed eyes, Dundee began slowly. I believe that's it. Listen, boys. He turned to the two plainclothesmen, urgent pleading in his voice. Would you both take your oath that there was no bag, say a small Gladstone overnight bag, anywhere in these rooms when you searched them this evening? The two detectives glanced at each other, their faces reddening. It was Harmon, the older of the pair, who swallowed hard before answering. We'd been told to look for a man hiding, and for a gun. Then he squared his shoulders as if to receive the blame like a man. Yes, sir. There was a small black grip on the closet shelf. I went through it myself, but there wasn't no gun in it, just a pair of pajamas and a couple of shirts, one of 'em dirty, some socks and collars, and a shaving kit. Dundee drew a deep breath and clapped the red-faced detective on the back in high humor. There simply had to be a bag somewhere, he laughed. This is the way of it, Strawn. Nita and Sprague rowed last night. Sprague tried to make it up, but Nita must have been through with him. Probably told him last night to clear his things out and not come back. She thought he had done so. Probably he did leave before she got up. At any rate, she was so sure he was gone, and his things with him, that she and Lydia went to town this morning, and left Ralph Hammond here to go through the place as freely as he liked, making his estimates on the job of finishing up the other half of this floor. And Ralph... But let that wait for a moment. Got any real proof that it was Sprague who stayed here and not the Hammond boy? Strawn interrupted shrewdly. I'm coming to the proof, Dundee assured him. Or rather, the rest of the proof that I haven't already given you. You're damned hard to convince, Chief. But let me go on with my theory, which I think covers the facts. At luncheon, when Nita received that note from Sprague, I imagine she got a hunch that he hadn't taken her seriously, that he had not removed his belongings. You remember Penny Crane said Nita had Lydia follow her into her bedroom as soon as Nita got home from the luncheon? Well, it's my hunch that Nita asked Lydia if Sprague's things were gone when she cleaned these rooms this morning, and that Lydia said no. Nita then probably told Lydia to pack them herself, and I feel positive that Lydia did so, for she must have felt safe when she protested to me that Sprague was not Nita's lover. I also feel sure that Sprague arrived at least half an hour before he said he did, by some back path across the meadow, that he came up to these rooms that he considered his, found his things packed, went about shaving and changing his shirt and collar regardless. I also feel sure that Lydia followed him upstairs to explain and impress upon him that Nita had meant what she said, and it is quite likely that she was not through picking up after him when he descended by the back stairs and surprised Janet Raymond on the front porch. That accounts, of course, for Lydia's not hearing the kitchen bell the first time Mrs. Dunlap rang. Strawn grunted. What about the proofs you're holding back? Come along, Chief. You too, Carraway, Dundee answered, and led the way into the bathroom. I felt sure these rooms would yield a very definite clue, even though Sprague, when he sneaked back tonight to get his telltale bag, apparently made every effort to wipe his fingerprints off the furniture and bathroom fixtures. Now, Carraway, if you'll step upon this little stool and look along the top of this medicine cabinet, you'll find what I found and didn't touch. The fingerprint expert did as he was told. When he stepped down, he was holding, between the very tips of his fingers, a safety razor blade. No dust on it, you see, Dundee pointed out. Now, if you don't find Dexter Sprague's fingerprints on it, my whole theory topples. How am I going to know whose fingerprints they are till we get hold of Sprague? Carraway asked reasonably. We don't need him, for that purpose at least, Dundee assured him. Downstairs in the living room, on a little table in the southeast corner of the room, you'll find a red glass ashtray which no one but Dexter Sprague used all evening. It was clean and empty when I saw him use it first. I think you'll find on it all the prints you need. Do you think Sprague killed her because she was through with him? Strawn asked. Dundee shook his head. "Since I don't like Dexter Sprague a little bit, Chief, I'd like to think so. But End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of Murder at Bridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Katie Gibney. Murder at Bridge by Anne Austen. Chapter 15. Bonnie Dundee's first thought upon awakening that Sunday morning was that it might prove to be rather a pity that his new bachelor apartment, as he loved to call his 3 rooms at the top of a lodging house, which had once been a fashionable private home, faced south and west rather than east. At the Rhodes house, whose boarding-house clamour and lack of privacy he had abandoned upon taking the flattering job and decent salary of special investigator attached to the district attorney's office, he had grown accustomed to using the hot morning sun upon his reluctant eyelids as an alarm clock. But, he continued the train of thought, after discovering by his watch that it was not late, only 8:40, it was pretty darn nice having diggings like these, quiet and private, for he was the only tenant now on the top floor. His pleased, lazy eyes roved over the plain severity but solid comfort of his bedroom, and on past the open door to take in appreciatively the equally comfortable and masculine living room. Pretty nice. That leather-upholstered couch and armchair had been a real bargain, and he liked them all the better for being rather scuffed and shabby. Then his eyes halted upon a covered cage, swung from a pedestal. "Poor old Cap'n! Must be wondering when the devil I'm going to get up." And he swung out of bed, lounged sleepily into the small living room, and whisked the square of black silk from the cage. The parrot, formerly the property of murdered old Mrs. Hogarth of the Rhodes house, but for the past year the young detective's official, Watson, ruffled his feathers, poked his green and yellow head between the bars of his cage, and croaked hoarsely, "Hullo! Hullo!" "Hullo yourself, my dear Watson," Dundee retorted. "Your vacation is over, old top. It's back on the job for you and me both. Which reminds me that I ought to be taking a squint at the Sunday papers to see how much Captain Strawn thought fit to tell the press." He found the Hamilton Morning News in the hall just outside his living room door. "Listen, Cap'n. Nita Selim murdered at Bridge. Probably the snappiest streamer headline the news has had for many a day. Now let's see." He was silent for 2 minutes while his eyes leaped down the lesser headlines and the column 1, page 1 story of the murder. Then, "Good old Strawn. Not a word, my dear Watson, about your absurd master's absurd performance in having 'The Death Hand at Bridge' replayed. Not a word about Ralph Hammond, the missing guest. Not a word about Mrs. Tracy Miles being hidden away in the clothes closet while her hostess was being murdered. In fact, my dear Watson, not a word about anything except Strawn's own theory that a hired gunman from New York or Chicago, preferably Nita's hometown, New York, of course, sneaked up, crouched in her window, and bumped her off. And life-size photographs of the big footprints under the window to prove his theory. By golly, Cap'n, I clean forgot to tell my former chief that I'd found Nita's will and note to Lydia. He'll think I deliberately held out on him. Well, I can't sit here all day gossiping with you, my dear Watson. Work, much work to be done. Then Sunday dinner with poor little Penny." 4 hours later a tired and dispirited young detective was climbing the stairs of an ugly 5-story walk-up apartment house in which Penny Crain and her mother had been living since the financial failure and flight of the husband and father, Roger Crain. "Hello there!" It was Penny's friendly voice hailing him from the topmost landing of the steep stairs. "All winded, poor thing?" His tired, unhappy eyes drank her in, the freshness and sweetness of a domestic Penny, so different from the thorny little office Penny who prided herself on her efficiency as secretary to the district attorney. Penny in flowered voile, with a saucy ruffled white apron, and there were purplish shadows under her brown eyes, and her gaiety lasted only until he had reached her side. "Shh! Have they found Ralph?" she whispered anxiously. He could only answer "No," and he almost choked on the word. "Mother's all of a twitter at my having a detective to dinner," she whispered, trying to be gay again. "She fancies you'll be wearing size 11 shoes and a 6-shooter at your belt." "Yes, Mother, it's Mr. Dundee." She did not look all of a twitter, this pretty but rather faded middle-aged little mother of Penny's. A gentle dignity and patient sadness, which Dundee was sure were habitual to her, lay in the faded blue eyes and upon the soft, sweet mouth. But Mrs. Crane was ushering him into the living room, and its charm made him forget for the moment that the Cranes were to be pitied because of their come-down in life. For every piece of furniture seemed to be authentic early American, and the hooked rugs and fine brocaded damasks allied themselves with the fine old furniture to defeat the ugliness with which the Maple Court Apartments architect had been fiercely determined to punish its tenants. "'Scuse me, gotta dish up," Penny flung over her shoulder as she ran away and left him alone with her mother. Dundee liked Mrs. Crane for making no excuses about a maid they could not afford, liked the way she settled into a lovely, ancient rocking chair and set herself to entertain him while her daughter made ready the dinner. Not a word was said about the horrible tragedy which had occurred the day before in the house which had once been her home. They talked of Penny's work, and the little gentlewoman listened eagerly, with only the faintest of sighs, as Dundee humorously described Penny's fierce efficiency and District Attorney Sanderson's keen delight in her work. "Bill Sanderson is a nice boy," the woman of perhaps 48 said of Hamilton's 35-year-old district attorney. "It is nice for Penny to work with an old friend of the family, or was, until..." And that was the nearest she came to mentioning the murder before Penny summoned them to the little dining room. Because Penny was watching him, and was obviously proud of her skill as a cook, skill recently acquired, he was sure, Dundee ate as heartily as his carefully concealed depression would permit. There was a beautifully browned 2-rib roast of beef, pan-browned potatoes, new peas, scalloped tomatoes, and, for dessert, a gelatin pudding which Penny proudly announced was Spanish cream, the secret of which she had mastered only that morning. "I was up almost at dawn to make it, so that it would be 'set' in time," she told him, and by the quiver of her lip Dundee knew that it was not Spanish cream which had got her up. "I'm going to help wash dishes," he announced firmly, and Penny, with a quick intake of breath, agreed. "Hadn't you better take a nap, Mother?" she added a minute later, as Mrs. Crane, with a slight flush on her faded cheeks, began to stack the dessert dishes. "You mustn't lay a hand on these dishes, or Bonnie and I will have our dishwashing picnic spoiled. Run along now. You need sleep, dear." "Not any more than you do, poor baby," Mrs. Crane quavered, and then hurried out of the room, since gentlewomen do not weep before strangers. "I called you 'Bonnie' so Mother would know we are really friends," Penny explained, her cheeks red, as she preceded him through the swinging door into the miniature kitchen. "You'll stick to that. Being friends, I mean, no matter what happens, won't you, Penny?" Dundee said in a low voice, setting the fragile crystal dishes he carried upon the porcelain drainboard of the sink. "I knew you had something bad to tell me. It's about Ralph, I suppose." Her husky voice was scarcely audible above the rush of hot water into the dishpan. "You'd better tell me straight off, Bonnie. I'm not a very patient person. Are they going to arrest Ralph when they find him? There wasn't a word in the paper about him this morning." "I'm afraid they are, Penny," Dundee told her miserably. "Captain Strawn has a warrant ready, but of course " "Oh, you don't have to tell me you hope Ralph isn't guilty," she cut in with sudden passionate vehemence. "Don't I know he couldn't have done it? They always arrest the wrong person first, the blundering idiots." It was the thorny Penny again, the Penny with glittering eyes which matched her nickname, but Dundee felt better able to cope with this Penny. "I'm afraid I'm the chief idiot, but you must believe that I'm sorry it should be a friend of yours," he told her, and reached for the plate she had rinsed of its suds under the hot water tap. "Shoot the works," she commanded with hard flippancy. "Of course I might have known that Captain Strawn's theory about a gunman was just dust in our eyes, and that only a miracle could keep you from fastening on poor Ralph, since he and the gun are both missing. Naturally it wouldn't occur to you that it might be an outsider, someone who had followed Nita and her lover, Sprague, from New York, to kill her for having left him for Sprague. Oh no, certainly not," she jibed, to keep from bursting into tears. An outsider would hardly have had access to Judge Marshall's pistol and Maxim silencer, he reminded her, and Captain Strawn received a wire from a ballistics expert in Chicago this morning, confirming our conviction that the same gun which fired the bullets against Judge Marshall's target fired the bullet which killed Nita Selim. You've washed that plate long enough. Let me dry it now. And there are other things, Penny." "Such as?" she challenged in her angry, husky contralto. "Sprague admitted to me this morning, after I had confronted him with proofs, that he sometimes slept in the upstairs bedroom." "I told you they were lovers!" Penny interrupted. "And that he slept there Friday night, after he and Nita had quarreled. He still contends that the row was over that movie of Hamilton business," Dundee went on, as if she had not spoken. "He admitted also that Nita had told him to take his things away when he left Saturday morning, but he says it was only because she didn't want Ralph Hammond to find a man's belongings there if he had occasion to go into the upstairs rooms in making his estimates for the finishing up of the other side. But he contends, and Lydia Carr, whom I also saw again this morning, supports him in it, that he stayed in the house occasionally when Nita was particularly nervous about being alone, and that they were not lovers." "Pooh! Don't wipe the flowers off that plate. Here's another." "I'm inclined to say 'pooh' too, Penny," Dundee assured her, "but Tracy Miles told me last night when he came to get Lydia that Nita really seemed to be in love with Ralph, part of the time at least." "Nita thought enough of Dexter Sprague to send him to come down here and to root her head off for him to get the job of making the movie," Penny reminded him fiercely, making a great splashing in the dishpan. "Then you don't think she was in love with Ralph?" Dundee asked. "Oh, I don't know," the girl cried. "I thought so sometimes, had the grace to hope so anyway, since Ralph was so crazy about her." "That's the point, Penny," Dundee told her gently. "Everyone I've talked to this morning, including Sprague, seems sure that Ralph Hammond was mad about Nita Selim." "So of course he would kill her?" Penny scoffed bitterly. "Yes, Penny. When he discovered Sprague's easily recognized cravats draped over the mirror frame in a bedroom in Nita's house, for they were there to be seen when Ralph went into that bedroom yesterday morning." "How do you know he saw them?" "Because he left this behind him," Dundee admitted reluctantly, and wiped his hands before drawing an initialed silver pencil from his breast pocket. "I found it under the edge of the bed. The initials are R.H." "Yes, I recognize it," Penny admitted, turning sharply away. "I gave it to him myself, for a Christmas present. I thought I could afford to give silver pencils away then. Dad hadn't bolted yet." She crooked an elbow and leaned her face against it for a moment. Then she flung up her brown bobbed head defiantly. "Well?" "Ralph must have been, well, in a pretty bad way, since he loved Nita and wanted to marry her," Dundee persisted painfully. "Remember that Polly Beale found him still there when she stopped to offer Nita a lift to break away in. It is not hard to imagine what took place. We know that Polly curtly canceled her luncheon engagement with Nita and the rest of you, and went into town with Ralph after making sure that Clive would join them. I saw young Hammond myself for an instant, without knowing who he was, and I remember now thinking that he looked far too ill to eat. I was lunching at the Stewart house myself when they came into the dining room, you know." "Plenty to hang him on, I see!" Penny cried furiously. "There's a little more, Penny," Dundee went on. "Polly Beale and Clive Hammond were mortally afraid that Ralph would come to the cocktail party. I'm sure Clive made Ralph promise to stay away, and that both Clive and Polly did not trust him to keep his promise. That is why, I am sure, Clive beckoned Polly to join him in the solarium, without entering the living room to speak to Nita. You remember they said they stayed there all during the playing of if you call it the death hand again, I'll scream. All right. They stayed there until Karen discovered the murder. I am sure they chose that place because of its many windows. They could watch for Ralph's car, dash out and head him off. Take him away by force if necessary, to keep him from making a scene. I believe they knew he had murder in his heart, and that he would find a way to get a gun." "Have you also found out that he stole Hugo's gun yesterday?" "I have found that it was possible for him to do so," Dundee said slowly. "The butler was off for the afternoon until 6 o'clock. There was no one in the house but the nursemaid and the 3-month-old baby." "Well, and I suppose you think Clive and Polly didn't have a chance to head Ralph off, as you say, but that they did see him running away after he killed her?" Her voice was still brittle with anger, but there were indecision and fear in it, too. "No," Dundee replied. "I don't think they saw him. I feel pretty sure he came into the house by the back way, and through the back hall into Nita's room. He must have known Clive and Polly would be on the lookout for him. At any rate, I have proof that whoever shot Nita from in front of that window near the porch door fled toward the back hall." And he told her of the big bronze lamp, whose bulb had been broken, reminding her of its place at the head of the chaise lounge, which was set between the two west windows. "That was the bang or bump Flora Miles heard while she was hiding in the closet," he explained. "I suppose Flora had told all of you about it? I thought so. Muffled as she was in the closet, it is unlikely that she could have heard Nita's frantic whisperings to Ralph. I doubt if he spoke at all. Nita must have been sure he was about to leave by the porch door." Dimly there came the ring of the telephone. With a curt word, Penny excused herself to answer it. Dundee went on polishing glasses with a fresh towel. "Bonnie!" Penny was coming back, walking like a somnambulist, her brown eyes wide and fixed. "That was Ralph! And he doesn't even know Nita is dead!" End of chapter 15.
Of Murder at Bridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Carl, St. Louis, Missouri, September 2007. Murder at Bridge by Anne Austen. Chapter 16. Of course, I recognized his voice instantly when he said, "That you, Penny?" "And it's a wonder I didn't scream," said Penny Crain, fighting her way up through dazed bewilderment to explain in detail, in answer to Dundee's pelting questions. "I said, 'Of course, Ralph, where have you been?' And he said, in that coaxing, teasing voice of his that I know so well, 'Peeved, Penny? I don't blame you, honey. You really ought not to let me come over and explain why I stood you up last night, but you will, won't you?' Nice Penny. That's exactly how he talked, Bonnie Dundee, exactly. Oh, don't you see how he couldn't know that Nita is dead?" "Did you ask him where he was?" Dundee asked finally. "No, I just told him to come on over, and he said I could depend on it that he wouldn't waste any time. Oh, Bonnie, what shall we do?" "Listen, Penny," Dundee urged rapidly. "You must realize that I've got to see and hear, but I don't want Ralph Hammond to see me until after he's had a talk with you. Will you let me eavesdrop behind these portieres? I know it's a beastly thing to do, but—" Penny agreed at last, and within 10 minutes after that amazing telephone call Dundee, from behind the portieres that separated the dining and living room, heard Penny greeting her visitor in the little foyer. She had played fair, had not gone out into the hall to whisper a warning, if a warning was needed. He had seen Ralph Hammond enter the dining room of the Stewart house the day before, in company with Clive Hammond and Polly Beale, when the three had been strangers to him. But Dundee told himself now that he would hardly have recognized the young man whom Penny was preceding into her living room. The Ralph Hammond of Saturday had had a white, drawn face and sick eyes, but this boy— Like his older brother, Clive, Ralph Hammond had dark red curling hair, but unlike his brother's, his eyes were a wide, candid hazel, the green iris thickly flecked with brown. A little shorter than Clive, a trifle more slender, but that which held the detective's eyes was something less tangible but at once more evident than superlative masculine good looks. It was a sort of shy joyousness and buoyance, which flushed the tan of his cheeks, sang in his voice, made his eyes almost unbearably bright. Before Penny Crain, very pale and quiet, could sink into the chair she was groping toward, Ralph Hammond was at her side, one arm going out to encircle her shoulders. "Don't look like that, Penny!" Dundee heard him plead, his voice suddenly humble. "You're very right to be sore at me, honey, but please don't be. I know I've been an awful cad these last few weeks, but I'm myself again. I'm cured now, Penny. Wait, Ralph," Penny protested faintly, holding back as he would have hugged her hard against his breast. "What about Nita?" Dundee saw the young man's face go darkly red, but heard him answer almost steadily. "I'd hoped you'd understand without making me put it into words, honey. I'm cured of Nita. I can't express it any other way except to say I was sick, and now I'm cured." "You mean," Penny faltered, but with a swift, imploring glance toward Dundee, "you don't love Nita any more? You can't deny you were terribly in love with her, Ralph. Lois told me last night that Nita had told her in strictest confidence that she had promised to marry you just Thursday night." The boy's face was very pale as he dropped his hands from Penny's shoulders, but Dundee, from behind the portieres, was not troubling to spy for the moment. He was too indignant with Penny for having withheld from him the vital fact of Nita's engagement to Ralph Hammond. "That's true, Penny," Ralph was saying dully. "You have a right to know, because I'm asking you to marry me now. I did propose to Nita again Thursday night, and she did accept me. I confess now I was wild with happiness." "Why did she refuse you before?" Penny cut in, and Dundee silently thanked her for asking the question he would have liked to ask himself. "Was it because she wasn't sure she was in love with you?" "You're making it awfully hard for me, honey," the boy protested, then admitted humbly, "Of course you want to know. And you should know. No, she said all along, almost from the first, that she loved me more than I could love her, but that there were reasons. 2 reasons, she always said. And once I asked her jealously if they were both men, but she looked so startled and then laughed so queerly that I didn't ask again. Then I thought it might be because I was younger than she was, though I can't believe she's more than 23 or so, and I'm 25, you know. And once I got cold sick because I thought she might still be married, but she said her husband was married again, and I wasn't to ask questions or worry about him." "But she did accept you Thursday night?" Penny persisted. "Yes," the boy admitted, his face darkly flushed again. "This is awfully hard, honey, but I'll tell you once for all and get it over with. I took her to dinner. We drove to Burnsville because she said she was sick of Hamilton. When we were driving back she suddenly became very queer, reckless, defiant, and she asked me if I still wanted to marry her, and I said I did. I asked her right then to say when, and she said she'd marry me June 1st, but she added," and the boy, to Dundee's watching eyes, seemed to be genuinely puzzled again by what must have sounded so odd at the time, "that she'd marry me June 1st if she lived to see the day." "Oh!" Penny gasped then, controlling her horror. She asked with what sounded like real curiosity, "Then what happened, Ralph? Why did you propose to her on Thursday and to me on Sunday?" "Gorgeous actress sacrificed to the typewriter," Dundee told himself as he waited for Ralph Hammond's reluctant reply. "Can't we forget it, honey? You do love me a little, don't you? Can't you take my word for it that I'm cured now forever?" Penny's hands went up to cover her face, and Dundee had the grace to feel very sorry indeed for her, sorry even if she intended to give her promise to Ralph Hammond, as a sick feeling in his stomach prophesied that she was about to do. "How can I know you're really cured if I don't know what cured you?" "I suppose you're right," the boy admitted miserably. "There's no need to ask you not to tell anyone else, although I don't want to see her again ever. Why, Penny, I couldn't even tell Polly and Clive yesterday after it happened, though Polly guessed and went upstairs. I tried to keep her back " "I don't quite understand, Ralph," Penny interrupted. "You mean something happened when you were at Nita's house yesterday morning?" "Yes. Judge Marshall had promised Nita to have the unfinished half of the top story turned into a maid's bedroom and bath and a guest bedroom and bath. Clive let me go to make the estimates. Of course I was glad of the chance to see Nita again. I hadn't been with her since Thursday night. But she had to take Lydia in for a dentist's appointment, and they left me alone in the house. I had to go into the finished half to make some measurements, and in the bedroom I found oh, God!" he groaned and pressed a fist against his trembling mouth. "You found that Dexter Sprague was staying there and using the bedroom that used to be mine, didn't you?" Penny helped him at last in desperation. "How did you know?" The boy stared at the girl blankly for a moment, then seemed to crumple as if from a new blow. "I suppose it was common gossip that Nita and Sprague were lovers, and I was the only one she fooled. My God, to think all of you would stand by and let me marry her! A cheap little gold digger from Broadway, living with a cheap four-flusher she couldn't get along without, and had to send for " "Did you want to kill her, Ralph?" Penny whispered, touching one of his knotted fists with a trembling hand. "Kill her? Good Lord, no!" the boy flung at her violently. "I'm not such an ass as that. You girls are all alike. Polly had so little sense as to think I'd want to kill Nita and Sprague both. She couldn't see, and neither could Clive, that all I wanted was to get away from everybody and get so drunk I could forget what a fool I'd been." "What did you do, Ralph?" Penny asked urgently. "Why, I got drunk, of course," the boy answered, as if surprised at her persistence. "Darling, you wouldn't believe me if I told you how much rot-gut Scotch it took to put me under, but that filthy bootlegging hotel clerk would have charged me twice what he did for the stuff if he had known how much good it would do me." "Hotel?" Penny snatched at the vital word. "Where did you go to get drunk, Ralph?" "I never realized before that you had so much curiosity, honey," the boy grinned at her. "After I shook Clive, Polly went on to Nita's bridge party, because she couldn't throw her down at the last minute. I wandered around until I came to the Railroad Men's Hotel, down on State Street, you know, the other side of the tracks. It's a miserable dump, but I sort of hankered for a place to hide in that was as miserable and cheap as I felt." "Did you register under your own name?" "Ashamed of me, Penny? No, I registered under my first two names, Ralph Edwards, and the rat-faced filthy little hotel clerk turned out to be a bootlegger. Well, when I woke up about 11 this morning I give you my word I wasn't sick and headachy, though God knows I'd drunk enough to put me out for a week. Penny, I woke up feeling, well, I can't explain it, but to say I felt light and new and clean, all washed up. At first I thought my heart was empty, it felt so free of pain, but as I lay there thanking God that that was that, I found my heart wasn't empty at all. It was brimming full of love. Gosh, honey, I sound like a Laura Jean Libbey hero, don't I? But before I rang you from the lunchroom where I ate breakfast, I wrote Nita a special delivery note, telling her it was all off. I had to be free, actually, before I could ask you. You will marry me, won't you, Penny honey? I knew this morning I had never really loved anyone else." Penelope Crain remained rigid for a moment. Then very slowly she laid both her hands on his head, for he had knelt and buried his face against her skirt. But as she spoke, her brown eyes, enormous in her white face, were upon Dundee, who had stepped silently from behind the portieres. "Yes, I'll marry you, Ralph. You may come in now, Mr. Dundee." End of chapter 16.